Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining us. And while you're with us, please take a moment to subscribe below. This is an essay in three parts, or three videos, exploring and explaining the future of economic capitalism and the sort of artificially re-engineered society that will be needed to be put in place to underwrite such neo-capitalism, along with how and why the globalists are forcing against considerable resistance this new world order, this neo-social order, on an unwilling and often unwitting populace. As much as anything, this essay is about how the political marketplace and the marketplace of ideas regarding civic governance and civic participation have been shut down, completely shut down, all across the Western world. The recent social order in the Western world was a social contract between the governing and the governed. It grew organically over many hundreds of years into a balance of interests and obligations, or power sharing and protections between the classes of people, classes of society. It is a contract that held that all would be treated equally under the law, the rule of law. All were entitled to due legal process in a court independent of any sort of political interference, freedom of the press, regular elections where winners and losers would abide by the rules. Politicians were from and voted into government by each local geographical area, voted by people they knew and who knew them. Rulers were bound to achieving the consensus, the wider social consensus, by and from consent of the governed. The consent of the governed is key. What we are witnessing today in real time, all the tumult and the chaos and the deception, is the active and aggressive top-down dismantling of this social contract by a globalist elite forcing and implementing a neo-capitalist world order which rewrites the rules of political, social and economic engagement of all Western citizenry. So let's go back to where this began, where it began as an idea, then slowly as a policy, until it was something that was being actually implemented on the ground. What was the genesis of such a radical shift in political economy and social economic ideology? Capitalism and the many capitalist think tanks created and lavishly funded to foretell the future and propagate thought leadership narratives. They were focused principally on identifying economic opportunities for profitable exploitation, asking series of, in effect, hypotheticals, if you will, such as where the most likely and least profitable investments would be distributed and where they'd be found on the globe, what industries and sectors would they be in, and so on. So these think tanks, these capitalist think tanks, were looking for profit opportunities. Where would they be? Where would they come from? Over what time frame? And so on. Now, it's a big ask, prognosticating to the future there, but this is what these think tanks were attempting to do. And this was something that was very prominent in the 1960s. Now, in the 1960s, which is where the first notions of the world we now live in can be tracked back to, the prognostications of many influential think tanks was at the time infected with a sense of gloom. The post-World War II reconstruction boom was almost exhausted. The home electronic appliances boom, such as fridges and washing machines and so on, was running out of steam. The computer revolution was largely unforeseen at this time. There was genuine, if overly pessimistic, concern that the world economy in, say, 1969, 1970, 71 was on the verge of another Great Depression, or at least a high risk of entering a period of endless global stagnation, but with also high inflation. This was known as stagflation at the time, and the oil shocks, which came a year or two later, seemed to confirm these very pessimistic views. The theories of those times postulated that capital accumulation, or levels of retained business profit, were already in decline and would be insufficient going forward for any meaningful new investment in factories, offices, capital equipment and so on. Moreover, such a decline in capital accumulation, and thus capital surpluses for reinvestment, would fail to provide mass employment, but would also be insufficient to provide any economic expansion for the near-term future and beyond. In other words, there simply wasn't going to be enough retained profit to fund and invest in the next generation of business activity, or this was the gloomy forecast at the time. It was a position that was deeply flawed, and as mentioned above, overly pessimistic. However, when we look at the times and the influences that had shaped the minds and fears of all those involved, the views that achieved widespread currency in the day were not wholly unreasonable when one considers that the primary influences, that the main influences of the time, but were, for example, the Great Depression, which was still raw and fresh on the minds of many, the Cold War, which was very serious at the time. Nuclear Armageddon was considered a definite possibility, and military confrontation at minimum with the communist bloc was seen as a likely reality. And again, apocalyptic ideas and thoughts were put forward around that. Since World War II ended, wages and increased productivity largely trended together. Productivity and wages seemed to be going along around the same trajectory. And as productivity rose sharply in this time, the twin effect of increased efficiencies in business, that is productivity, that were on one hand delivering cheaper consumer goods, such as the aforementioned fridges and washing machines, but also wages were increasing pretty much in line, which meant that nearly all workers with a full-time job could own property and support a family, go on annual vacations and so on. Now, given about 75% of the population had full-time jobs, then pretty much you're looking at 75% of the population you would call today middle class. Now that's shrunk today to less than 25%, and most of those are relying heavily on inheritance to be in the middle class. It's not coming out of their own income. Nevertheless, many think tanks opined at the time that worker prosperity was a clear sign of a wider inflation problem rather than outcome, high standards of living for the citizenry, to be celebrated. Radical change to this worker prosperity paradigm was needed, so it was thought. But what form would this take? How could change or such change be effected when Western bodies politic, who were accommodating of corporate interests and they, the business lobby groups were still operating then, or certainly not to the extent they are today. But the body politic, the politicians believed that they actually represented the voters and the workers, and they were focused and wanted to improve the lives of their fellow citizens. The obstacles to adequate capital accumulation were seen primarily as wage rises or the wage levels in general that were seen as just simply too high. The power of the trade unions and an absence or an inability to clearly identify new profit frontiers were seen in themselves as obstacles. So where would the next round, the new profit frontiers, where would the next round of big bucks come from? Nobody knew in these think tanks, and they were casting around gloomily for all sorts of measures that were going to solve the problems, many of which were imagined rather than actual. But nobody knew, and as a result, the smart money, the big money, were wringing their hands in anxiety. Something must be done, they thought. It had a type of pressure cooker effect on things, these guys urgently wanting to do something but not knowing what. This confusion developed a kind of a siege mentality, an anxiety combined to set the stage for what would soon become an ideological social economic toxicity, and that is the globalization that we see today. Among indirect concerns of the day, and from the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the Soviet Union openly boasted, with overly bellicose propaganda, that communism could deliver a better, fairer, and more equitable standard of living than could capitalism. Capitalist policymakers and economic thinkers alike believed that capitalism must appear more attractive to workers than communism, lest the workers embrace communism as a viable alternative. And that was seen as a possibility back in the day. It was seen as giving workers a bigger share of GDP profits than they really deserved. And it was seen as a sort of a bribe, this is the higher wages, to ensure workers supported capitalism. He was only grudgingly paid these high wages, were only grudgingly paid, however, and formed part of the building resentment among the capitalist elites that they had for workers. It seems counterintuitive now to realise that the communist Soviet Union, by its mere existence, was an indirect protector of Western worker wages and prosperity. The first efforts to restrain wages and curb arbitrary union power came with various attempts to reach an accord, or a prices and incomes policy where business, government and unions met and agreed on the core economic issues, including how wealth should be produced, created, shared and distributed. But other than Germany and Japan and some one-off sector examples in the United States, such as attempts at accord, or such attempts rather at accord, were spectacularly unsuccessful, as both business and unions came to the table with somewhat fixed ideological positions. It's perhaps not surprising that little was achieved, and a golden opportunity to set a path ahead for practical and meaningful engagement for the future was squandered. It was lost at this time. Now, rather than a head-on confrontation with organised labour, the preferred method back then, at least, of reducing wages, initially at first, was to bring women into the workforce in large numbers, particularly in the service industries where productivity increases are much more difficult to achieve. Productivity can be increased in a factory, for example, by better organisation or more machinery or more up-to-date machinery and so on. But in the service industries, productivity is much harder to come by. This quickly became an article of faith, bringing women into the workforce in mass, with employers and again these think tanks as pretty much a fix-all. In this regard, trade unions were strangely acquiescent, seemingly prepared to accept lower wages overall, that is, with women coming to the workforce, and through this declining paycheck purchasing power for union members, in return for the ideological ecstasy of an equal outcome socialist nirvana. Union power was definitely wound back, and the 80s is a good example, and that's when the real tussles for supremacy with unions came along. And some examples of this are, for example, the air traffic controllers in the United States, and then President Ronald Reagan was a player in that one. The coal miners in Britain, that was the Margaret Thatcher time. With the building and other industrial unions in, for example, places like Australia, union power was substantially curbed. And this is when the what we would call the political left pretty much moved into the centre economically. They stopped talking about crazy nationalisation schemes and various other sort of traditionally leftist or soft Marxist, and started talking more about very central policies in terms of economic management. And this is where this happened at around the same time as the union power was being busted up. So again, we can see the pieces moving slowly into place here for what today we see as the globalist situation. Now, the intellectual basis for arguing is the economic think tanks did, that union power was forcing up wages and worker pay rises generally, and the high worker wages lay at the centre of limiting or preventing capital accumulation, was, I believe, dishonest in the extreme. Most, although not all, pay claims and strikes in support of them were catch-up pay rises, as the downward drift of declining pay packet purchasing power started to bite, particularly from the mid-1980s onwards. Workers were and unions were sharing the frustration that the pay packet of, for example, 1985 was buying substantially less than the pay packet of 1970. Some unions were spared, though, even though they were ideologically radical examples, such as teachers' unions and other clerical government-employed unions. Only private sector unions were to be smashed, it seemed. All across the Western world, teacher unions were and are surprisingly influential. Indeed, their influence has increased, and governments are typically unwilling to offend them in any way. Look at the Democrat Party in the United States now. Indeed, educational unions have been uniquely spared anything like the rough treatment meted out to other unions, and again, particularly those unions in the private sector. Similarly, the doomsayers failed to observe that it was frequently the most efficient and highly protected crony industries which were in profit decline, such as steel and automobile manufacture, or where profit was not a meaningful measure of viability because the business or industry sector was so badly managed and suffered profit decline accordingly. And we need to consider the protected industries at the time behind tariff walls or quotas. They were building very inefficient organisations and really had no motivation to become more efficient and to do a better job. And this showed in the sort of management that they had, very cronyistic at the top. It was all buddies hiring each other, and it was easy money. They just sat at the top of a very protected industry, collecting their big salaries. But as protection declined, and for example, Japanese automobiles penetrating the United States as a case in point, then this inefficiency was exposed, and these organisations suffered. And we can think of GM more recently, but earlier than that, Chrysler and so on. It was in these declining industries where most pay claims were in evidence. As efficiencies declined, so did profits, while the means to deal with the problem, in the private sector at least, was seen exclusively in terms of reducing worker wages or demanding more work time for the same pay. So as these protected industries declined in efficiency, and the efficiency caused a decline in profit, the only solution was seen at the time wasn't increasing efficiency or getting better quality management or organisational development or innovation, anything like that. It was seen as the only answer. And there was no other answer. The only answer was to decrease worker pay, that was the only source of profits going forward. So it was seen. We can look back now, or even many at the time, and look at how myopic and short-sighted that was. But it was how things were seen. Worker pay had to be reduced in order to allow this profit accumulation. Another complaint from business and the think tanks generally was the allegation that in the unfolding age or information age, workers were insufficiently educated and skilled to perform the work and tasks to be considered as viable employees. They just didn't have the proper skills, it was argued. The cost of worker training and education, it was similarly argued, cut deeply into the business bottom line, and again was seen as an impediment to capital accumulation. And it was also seen as should not be a cost that business should have to carry. Training costs should be socialised, and workers must pay for their own training, that is to go to college and so on, to be employment ready. And there's more on this subject later, but these were effectively the obstacles that were seen for capital accumulation, and these were to form the beginnings of the intellectual justification for, again, what we see today as globalisation. Now, I hope you stay with this series. Part 2 in the next video will be released shortly, and I invite you to go and have a look at that and have a listen to that and just see how this whole thing plays out. At the end of this 3-part series, you should have a fairly comprehensive understanding of how globalization took place and the effect it's having on, why it's having that effect and where we go from here. So thank you for listening. This is Tacitus today, and we'll talk again soon.